On the eastern face of the Rock of Gibraltar, tucked into limestone cliffs that drop straight into the Mediterranean Sea, there is a cave that had not seen daylight for roughly 40,000 years. The entrance was not bricked up or locked. Nobody put a sign on it. A slow accumulation of compacted sand had sealed a 13-meter chamber at the back of a cave called Vanguard, part of a complex that sits at the very bottom of Europe, separated from Africa by just 8 miles of open water. The sand built up over thousands of years until the room behind it was completely cut off. No air, no light, no disturbance. When researchers from the Gibraltar National Museum finally pushed through that seal, they were not just entering a room. They were entering the last known address of a species that most of the world had written off as primitive brutes who died out and left almost nothing behind. What the cave contained forces a direct question. What if everything we thought we knew about them was wrong? What was sealed inside? The chamber sat 13 meters deep inside Vanguard Cave. The team, led by Professor Clive Finlayson, director of the Gibraltar National Museum, accessed it after a survey project running since 2012 identified softer sediment in the rear wall. When they widened the gap enough to enter, they found a space that had been sitting in perfect preservation since the late Pleistocene. Inside were the bones of lynx, hyena, and vulture, resting exactly where they had been left. There was a shell from a large whelk, an edible marine snail. That shell could not have arrived in the chamber naturally. It had been carried there deliberately, from the shoreline, through the cave, and placed in that room. There were stone tools consistent with Mysterian technology, the tool-making tradition associated exclusively with Neanderthals, found close to the surface of the sediment, placing them near the final period of activity before the sand sealed everything. Near the entrance area of the chamber, researchers also found a child's milk tooth in a layer associated with Neanderthal activity. That single detail matters more than it might seem. The cave was not a temporary hunting shelter. Family groups were using this space. Children were there. This was domestic life, not a campsite. Because the chamber was sealed so completely, the chemical composition of the soil was never contaminated by modern pollutants. This makes it one of the best preserved environments for recovering ancient DNA from floor sediments anywhere on Earth. Researchers are still working through what those sediments contain. The Gibraltar National Museum has announced that sediment analysis is currently underway to identify microscopic plant remains and pollen trapped at that depth, which could reveal details about diet, season of occupation, and the environment around the rock. At the moment, the sand sealed the room. They also plan to continue excavation deeper into the chamber to determine whether burial sites exist further inside the limestone. Finlayson stated plainly that given the age of the sealing layer, the only species that could have left those materials inside was Neanderthals. And that is where the real argument begins. The species. Nobody took seriously. The standard picture of Neanderthals needs to land properly before anything else, because almost everything most people carry about them is wrong. The image that settled into popular culture, the stooped, dim, club-dragging primitive, came mostly from a misreading of a single skeleton found in France in 1908. The individual had severe arthritis that bent his spine and altered his posture. That one misread skeleton shaped the entire public perception of an entire species for most of the 20th century. Neanderthals existed for roughly 200,000 years. Modern humans have existed for around 300,000. Every human civilization in recorded history, from ancient Egypt to the present day, fits inside a window of about 5,000 years. Neanderthals survived for 200,000. Whatever they were not failures. Their brains were, on average, slightly larger than ours. Their bodies were built for cold climates, with broader chests and shorter limbs that retained heat more efficiently. They controlled fire. They cooked food. They made complex stone tools that required planning and memory to produce. They lived across a range stretching from Britain to Siberia to the Middle East. They were also not limited to one environment. Neanderthal remains have been found in Mediterranean coastal settings, in dense forests, on cold, open steppes, and in mountain regions. A species that can adapt across that range of environments is not operating on simple instinct. The cave in Gibraltar is significant, precisely because it sits at the southern edge of that range. The Strait of Gibraltar was a barrier Neanderthals did not cross. The rock was as far south as they went, and Gibraltar, with its stable Mediterranean climate and year-round food sources from both land and sea, may have been where the last of them lived longer than anywhere else on Earth. What the Gorham's Cave complex has already revealed. The sealed chamber in Vanguard Cave is new, but the larger Gorham's Cave complex, designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2016, has been producing pieces of the same story for decades. Each one has pushed the same conclusion harder. Researchers excavating the main Gorham's Cave found evidence that Neanderthals there were eating seafood on a significant scale. Mussel shells, fish bones, seal remains, dolphin bones. None of that material washed in naturally. It was hunted and brought to the cave. Neanderthals were fishing and hunting marine mammals in the Mediterranean. That is not the behavior of an animal operating on instinct. That is a species planning and managing a food supply across multiple environments simultaneously. In 2012, a large-scale study examined 1,699 Pleistocene sites across Eurasia and found a consistent pattern. Wherever Neanderthal occupation was confirmed, the bones of raptors and corvids, birds like eagles, vultures, and jackdaws, were significantly overrepresented. Crucially, the wing bones of these birds showed cut marks, consistent with deliberate feather removal. The meat of these birds was not being consumed. Only the large flight feathers were being extracted, systematically, repeatedly, across thousands of years and across the entire Neanderthal geographic range. The study, published in PLOS One, concluded that Neanderthals were using feathers as personal adornment, and that this practice preceded the arrival of modern humans in Europe by thousands of years. There was no possibility the behavior was learned from us. Then in 2014, the same team excavating Gorham's Cave found something carved into the bedrock itself. Buried beneath an undisturbed layer of Mysterian artifacts was a crosshatch pattern, a deliberate geometric design made by passing a pointed stone tool into grooves in the dolomite repeatedly, a minimum of 54 strokes to produce. Researchers ran experiments to confirm the markings could not have been produced by accident, by animal activity, or by a utilitarian task like scraping hides. The engraving was made before the sediment layer above it was deposited, and that layer has been dated to more than 39,000 years ago. Published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, the lead researcher said clearly, "The design demonstrates the Neanderthal capacity for abstract thought and expression through geometric forms." When asked directly whether it counted as art, Finlayson said it was abstract, it was deliberate, and it spoke to their cognition in a way that brings Neanderthals closer to us. That was not the oldest piece of Neanderthal art confirmed. A cave in the Loire Valley of France called La Roche-Cotard holds that record. When it was first excavated in the early 20th century, researchers noticed finger-dragged lines on the soft chalk walls in organized, structured patterns. Nobody could date them precisely for decades. In 2023, a team published a study in PLOS One, analyzing 50 sediment samples from inside and around the cave using optically stimulated luminescence dating. The cave had been completely sealed by cold period sediments for more than 57,000 years. Modern humans had not yet arrived in the region when those lines were made. The only hominins present were Neanderthals. The study confirmed the markings as the oldest known Neanderthal cave engravings ever recorded, pushing the evidence for Neanderthal symbolic behavior back nearly 20,000 years further than Gorham's cave. They were keeping their sick alive. In 1953, excavations at Shanidar Cave in what is now northern Iraq uncovered the remains of 10 Neanderthal individuals. One of them, known as Shanidar 1, stopped researchers cold. This individual had been struck in the face with a crushing blow early in life, likely blinding the left eye. The damage extended to the brain regions controlling the right side of the body, resulting in a withered right arm that appears to have been either paralyzed or amputated below the elbow. He had a healed fracture of the right foot that would have caused a noticeable limp, arthritis, and probable partial deafness. His skeleton shows that all of these injuries had healed. He survived to an estimated age of between 35 and 45 years, which for a Neanderthal was old age. The Smithsonian Institution's Human Origins Program has noted directly that Shanidar 1 would not have been able to survive without the sustained care of his social group. He could not have hunted effectively. He could not have fully contributed to camp life. For 10 to 15 years, his group fed him, sheltered him, and kept him alive. That is not instinct. That is a decision. Shanidar 1 was not a unique case. Researchers at the University of York, who have studied Neanderthal skeletons across multiple sites, found that between 70 and 80% of the individuals examined showed healed injuries, many of which would have been fatal without sustained help from others. Broken bones that healed cleanly, infections that resolved, conditions that would have left individuals completely dependent for extended periods. Across dozens of sites and tens of thousands of years, the same pattern holds. Neanderthal communities were not leaving their injured behind. Analysis of dental tartar from Neanderthal remains at a site in Spain called El Cidrón, found traces of yarrow and chamomile embedded in the calculus. Both are bitter-tasting plants with almost no nutritional value. One individual also showed traces of poplar, which contains salicylic acid, the active compound in aspirin, alongside evidence of the antibiotic mold penicillium. That same individual showed signs of intestinal parasites causing acute diarrhea. The pattern is specific enough that researchers concluded these plants were being consumed deliberately, not accidentally, and not for food. Neanderthals were self-medicating. They understood which plants in their environment had therapeutic value, and they were using them with intent. The part that is inside you. Here is where the story stops being about a sealed cave in Gibraltar and starts being about the person reading this. In 2010, the first sequenced Neanderthal genome was published. The results were unambiguous. All modern humans whose ancestry traces outside of Africa carry Neanderthal DNA. The current scientific consensus places that figure at between 1% and 4% of the genome, depending on ancestry. A more precise timeline, published in December 2024, determined that the interbreeding began roughly 50,500 years ago and lasted about 7,000 years, ending around the time Neanderthals began to disappear. That means modern humans and Neanderthals were not just coexisting. They were living alongside each other, forming relationships, and having children together for 7,000 years. The entire history of ancient Egypt, from First Dynasty to Roman conquest, spans about 3,000 years. The overlap between our two species lasted more than twice that long. The Neanderthal DNA that persisted in the modern human genome was not neutral. Researchers found that Neanderthal genes appear in regions connected to immune function, skin and hair characteristics, and metabolism. Some of that inherited DNA helped modern humans adapt to environments outside Africa. The genes that made Neanderthals suited to cold northern climates were passed on, and they are still operating in human bodies today. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The species that made art in Gibraltar, that hunted dolphins from the Mediterranean coast, that decorated themselves with eagle feathers, that kept their wounded alive for over a decade, did not simply vanish. A portion of them became US. Why Gibraltar matters more than anywhere else. Most of Europe went cold during the last glacial period. Neanderthal populations collapsed as ice sheets spread south. The standard extinction date, given in most textbooks, is around 40,000 years ago. Gibraltar did not go cold in the same way. The climate remained stable. Food sources stayed available. The Gorham's Cave Complex sits at sea level, facing the Mediterranean, with access to marine food, land animals, and plant resources across all seasons. It was, in practical terms, the most livable corner of Europe during the period when the rest of the continent was becoming uninhabitable. For a species that had not yet developed the cold weather clothing technology that modern humans were already using further north. Radiocarbon dating from Gorham's Cave suggests Neanderthal occupation continued there until somewhere between 33,000 and 24,000 years ago, thousands of years after the species had disappeared everywhere else on the continent. Some researchers put the lower bound even later than that. That is not a footnote. That is a refuge. The last Neanderthals on Earth were not scattered survivors fading across a continent. They were concentrated in one place, at the bottom of Europe, on a rock facing the sea, still hunting, still using tools, still living in caves they had occupied for tens of thousands of years, while the rest of their kind was already gone. The sealed chamber in Vanguard Cave preserves the end of that story. The animal bones left inside, the marine shell that was carried there, the milk tooth of a child. These are the material remains of one of the last communities of a species that walked the earth for 200,000 years. Nobody bricked that chamber up. The sand just came. And for 40,000 years, it sat there, perfectly preserved, waiting. What this changes. For most of the last century, Neanderthals were a convenient story. The primitive cousin, the dead end, the proof that evolution eventually produced something better. That story made the history of humanity feel clean and linear. The cave does not support it. The crosshatch in Gorham's bedrock does not support it. The 57,000-year-old finger lines in La Roche-Cotard do not support it. The eagle feathers do not support it. The wounded man kept alive for a decade in Shanidar does not support it. The DNA inside you does not support it. What the evidence supports is a species that was intelligent, emotionally capable of caring for its most vulnerable members, and that survived longer than any human civilization has ever lasted. A species that did not simply go extinct, but partly merged with ours, leaving genetic material still active in living human bodies. The sealed chamber in Vanguard Cave is not the closing chapter of a dead-end species. It is the final room in a story that never actually ended. It just took 40,000 years and a narrow gap in a wall to start reading it properly. If you got something out of this, subscribing takes 3 seconds, and it helps us keep making content like this.